Değerli konuklar, sevgili izleyicilerimiz, Fikir ve Önderleri yayınımıza hepiniz hoş geldiniz efendim. Dünyanın farklı yerlerinden farklı gelişmelere dair güzel konuklarımızla birlikte değişik konuları ele almaya, farklı konuları masaya yatırmaya devam ediyoruz. Bugün de çok değerli bir konuğumuz bizlerle birlikte olacak. Ben hepinizin alışık olduğu şu duyuruları bir kez daha yapmayı arzu ediyorum müsaadenizle. YouTube, Instagram ve Twitter'da aynı anda canlı yayındayız. Bunlardan herhangi birinden bizi izleyebilirsiniz. Ama konuğumuza soru yöneltmek istiyorsanız sizleri YouTube kanalımıza bekliyoruz. Evet, bugün çok değerli bir konuğumuz var. Aslında liderlik üzerine ağırlıklı çalışmalarını, değişim yönetimi üzerine ağırlıklı araştırmalarını götürüyor. Ama son dönemde özellikle çeşitlilik ve çeşitliliğin toplumsal, kültürel boyutuna dair de çok değerli çalışmalar ortaya koyuyor. Bizde yayınlanan bir makalesi gerçekten de çeşitliliğin kültürel boyutuyla ilgili çok güzel bir bakış açısı ortaya koymuştu. Bugün de sağ olsun bizi kırmadı, bizlerle birlikte oldu. Columbia Business School'dan sevgili Paul Ingram'la birlikteyiz. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be with you.
Yeah, it's pleasure as well. I had spent a lot of good words for you. So for the introduction, sorry for the Turkish again. Paul, for this show, I really want to start with a very broad general question about what's going on. And there is a debate going through about the future of capitalism, if this system is relevant enough for creating better value for the future and so forth. And as HBR, we have been publishing many articles about this topic. So I'm curious about your take on that. Do you think capitalism is flawed? We need to fix the system, or we need another completely different system for creating better value for the future?
Well, thank you for the question. So I come at that question from a perspective which is perhaps not typical of all business school professors, in that I've actually spent a lot of my career studying economic systems and organizations beyond capitalist organizations. So I've studied cooperatives and communes, and I've done some historical work that goes back to the era of mercantilism. And from that perspective, I have to say I'm not really very sympathetic to the idea that we'd be better off without capitalism, because I think, you have to say, what is the alternative?
Sure.
And certainly, all the criticisms we hear about, and some of the ones we'll talk about today, about problems with capitalist organizations on inclusion and equality and so on, the same you can say for cooperatives and communes and so on, that they often work best when they have very homogeneous populations. So I think it's what's the alternative? But at the same time, I'm completely sympathetic to the idea that we can do a lot to improve capitalism. I think one of the most interesting opportunities, and I think it's a real opportunity, is getting more people included, which means playing pivotal roles in organizations, having the opportunity, yes, to take the benefits of their product, but also to make full contributions. I actually think that in that sense, it would be good for everyone, economies and societies, if we could have a more inclusive capitalism, which is the spirit of some of the work I've been doing.
Yeah, I think the really magical word is inclusion, because lots of the things or flaws that are voiced about the inefficiency of capitalism at the end of the day comes and fixes in this inclusion issue. Another perspective for the starter is you also teach change management, and we are going through a tremendous change era. So what is your perspective about the huge change we are going through? Do you think the global corporations or business environment itself is doing a good job to manage this change?
I think in terms of what's been happening, I suppose I would have to say yes, that I do think the adjustment has been incredibly quick, and that in so many, of course, there's lots of differences here, but a lot of economic activity has been able to continue. I have also perhaps an atypical view in terms of what I think that these changes are going to mean for the future. in the United States, you can come across predictions all the time from people in business and universities who say that now we have a new way of operating and people aren't going to be visiting clients anymore and we're not going to be together in classrooms and so on again. And I don't think that's true. And partly my skepticism about that idea comes from research. You know, I've been studying in the last year, part of my research is on connectivities, what we call professional networks that help people share ideas and get things done and find support and so on. And they've been impacted very negatively by the kind of virtual interactions. You know, people do not connect virtually the same way they do face-to-face. I mean, it's a really striking difference. We've studied our MBA students at Columbia, and they're, you know, like at HBS, they come to the business school partly to get professional connections, and they're much less likely to do that in the last year than previously. Now, this doesn't mean that people couldn't learn to work with the new system, but it hasn't been as smooth a transition as people think just because their Zoom meetings work. You know, now there's something that we will do differently. We could never have an interaction like this across the globe without this technology, and I think that's just an incredible gain. But I think that we're going to be seeing the people in our city face to face, despite the technological alternatives. Now, I think there's been changes beyond the technology. In the United States, I think there's been a big decrease in institutions of all kinds. I suspect that you see that in Turkey and elsewhere. I think that's important change. I don't know how that's going to unfold, but I actually think it's probably bigger than the change in technology.
Right. Especially the face-to-face relations and interactions seems to be very important. I was chatting with a CEO of a large corporation here in Turkey yesterday, and they have a really fancy office. So I was just joking him, saying that you have just spent a hell lot of money for this office building. Now, are you unhappy to see that it is sitting there deserted? And he said, yes, I am. But the problem is the amount of innovation, of the innovative ideas that I receive every month has dropped dramatically, 60%, 70%, because lots of the innovative ideas are coming from interaction between people throughout this office. So it's not a physical space for us. It's a kind of a vehicle for creating more innovation. Now, I'm very concerned that our potential for creating innovation has gone down significantly. So I totally agree with you. It is really a hard downside for innovative companies, if I may say.
Yeah, exactly right. You also remind me, in terms of the kind of desire to get together. In the summer at Columbia, we taught all our courses virtually. But what I would have is I'd be teaching my students virtually, they'd be studying all day, and then they would go meet each other face to face in the park or in the restaurant or something, you know. So even if the organization was saying you have to be separate, they realized that getting together was very important to them.
Yeah. Paul, we will be going with the leadership and change issue in a while. But although you mainly study connections, you mainly study change management and leadership, I was really astonished when I read the article in Harvard Business Review about diversity and social inclusion. Because we have been publishing, or we have been covering many different angles of diversity, and at the end of the day, it's mainly focusing on systems and programs and other things, gender and race. But at the end of the day, it really struck me very strongly that you have another angle about the social class issue. So to begin with this diversity issue, what I'm curious is that there has been lots of things going on about diversity. We have been spending billions of dollars for diversity programs, and lots of companies are doing different things, creating different initiatives. We have been publishing lots of articles, nearly an article in every issue about this thing. But while you look at the research, we are not progressing in a way that, or in a pace that we would like to go with. So what's wrong with the diversity issue? Why it's not progressing in a significantly high-paced manner?
Oh, yeah. So my short answer to that is that I think a lot of these investments and efforts are not addressing the root cause of the problems of inclusion. So I'll just take an example of my own work, which, as you say, is on inclusion based on social class. So it turns out that in the United States, African Americans who come from the middle class or higher get the same results in terms of organizations and salaries and so on as their white counterparts. Now, there's a very big deficit for African Americans from lower class sources, but there really is a class effect. But if we treat it only as race, we have interventions that have really, in the last 30 years, helped or address the kind of stratum of the society that actually was doing okay, and then just neglected this really big population that was missed. So I would say broadly that I think this is often done with good intent, but I think that the targeting of a lot of these practices has not been about the root cause of the problem. And, if you think about a lot of things that come out in organizations, in the United States, I don't know how it is in Turkey, but the initial wave of efforts at diversity inclusion had this kind of cognitive psychological basis that was based on a kind of premise that people were discriminatory even though they didn't intend to be and want to be and so on. And it turned out and there was kind of these forced trainings. It turned out that whole body of effort seems to have moved things in the wrong direction, and that we're only now discovering, and I do think we are discovering, that actually if you put people on, skilled leaders in managers and organizations onto the problem of building an inclusive organization with a knowledge about how it benefits and things like innovativeness, they do it. And they're more effective than if you say that there's something wrong with you psychologically, you don't understand it, but you're bigoted, and kind of alienate them. So
right.
I'm happy to see that maybe we're on to a second generation of programs here that hopefully will be more successful than the first generation.
Right. I was just typing secretly and Googling another article because I couldn't recall the author. It was an article by Paul Robbins, and it was, I think the title of article was like, Why Diversity Programs Fail. So there was a really interesting insight in it. He was claiming that lots of the corporate programs that we are using today have their roots in a very defensive way, because lots of those programs, frameworks have been defined in 1960s, 70s, where we have been seeing the first class action cases coming through, and lots of banks and other companies are paying huge fines for settlement. So they sit down and thought, what should we do to mitigate this? So at the end of the day, all of the story began with a protective manner. And then time after time, we put more and more protective layers on it. And then now the root cause is not inclusive, but it's protective. I think it's a really good insight to go with that.
Agree.
Paul, the interesting thing in your article was the social class element. Because although in Turkey, we don't have so much a caste system, but we have a social class issue as well. But to be factually, I live in the Eastern Hemisphere. So the more you go east, the more caste system becomes an important issue, or social differences become an important issue. So why you specifically would like to highlight the social class issue in diversity?
Yeah, thank you. So let me also say a little something from my research about Turkey, because I've gone beyond the US and I've looked at the magnitude of the social class disadvantages, I call it, around the world. And it occurs around the world, and its magnitude in Turkey is almost exactly the same as it is in the United States. So
really?
if I order all of the countries of the world, United States and Turkey are side by side. So
right.
in a sense, it turns out that empirically what I'm talking about from the United States applies to Turkey. So I guess the reason I would say it's this attracted me is two reasons. One is that has not been on the agenda. As you said, we talk about race, ethnicity, and gender, and social class is, in a sense, it's almost been a taboo topic, as some authors in the Harvard Business Review have suggested. And the second thing that got my attention is that it was potentially, and I think now proven, a very big effect, right? So most people around the world consider themselves working or lower class. More people say they're working or lower class than say they're middle or upper class. An objective measure that a lot of research uses to identify class differences is whether one's parents had a college degree. By that measure, 75% of the population in the United States are from lower class origins. Probably it's even higher in Turkey. So this means that there's a very big population that could be affected. And the disadvantage they face is a big one. You know, it's not an order of magnitude larger, but in the United States, it's a little bit larger than the disadvantage that African Americans face or that women face, for example, in my research, becoming a manager. So all those groups are not included to the extent they should be. Social class is a really big group. Perhaps it's 75% of the population. So, you know, I'm just taken by the idea. You know, I'm a pragmatist, and I have a kind of managerial mindset. I love the idea of productive, efficient, innovative organizations. So imagine if we could add 1/3 to the set of effective managers that we have in the world, or more. You know, I think if we could resolve this problem, we'd add 1/3 or more to the set of effective managers. We'd have innovation. We'd have faster and better vaccination programs. We'd have efficiency. We'd have, you know, I just think we would all be better. So it's a under-recognized problem, and it turns out, I think, to be a big problem that if we could move in a direction to solve it, we'd be so much better off.
Yeah, and also what I find interesting about the social class element is that it is such an horizontal factor that it is tied to every issue. You cannot separate gender issue from social class. You cannot separate race issue from social class in many cultures. So it's really an interesting unrecognized or undervalued kind of an element that you have just picked up and bring with this article. So it's really interesting. So just to dig down a little bit about this social class thing, what does social class disadvantage mean for individuals, for companies, and for society? What does it mean for these three lenses?
Yeah, so let's start with the individual. So, you know, the way I studied social class disadvantage in the work I wrote about in HBR was about becoming a manager. And people from a lower social class origin are about 32% less likely to become a manager than someone from a higher social class throughout their lives. That 32% is a big difference. You know, people who are in managerial roles, yes, they get paid more, but they are more satisfied on their job. They live longer. They're happier in the moment. They feel autonomy and so on. So that's a big difference in career outcomes. So just in the sense that I think a 32% difference in pay for people who are equally qualified, we'd be really concerned about. I think we've got the same issue about kind of fairness at the individual level. But I'm just as excited, I'm just as excited about the implications of this for organizations and beyond. So organizations are missing a lot of potentially good managers. So there's some evidence in the United States, comes out of the military, that shows that leaders from lower social class origins are less self-oriented, they're less narcissistic, they're more concerned for the people they're leading, right? So there's those skills. There's some organizations, perhaps we'll talk about them in this conversation, that have, as so much of the world are people from lower social class origins. They have employees and customers in those groups, and they do a better job accessing them if their management also has some representation from that group. And then if you just get to the societal level, I think one of the most compelling statistics we found is that countries that do more to include people from lower social class origins in the managerial ranks, they have higher GDP per capita. So just getting back to my point that they're just producing more, and I think that's to the benefit of everyone. So I don't see this as a kind of zero sum, that if we take a managerial job, we'll take it away from someone whose father or mother went to college and give it to someone else. I actually see this as an opportunity really to improve organizations in the economy, and I think that would just benefit everybody.
Yeah, there's a question from the audience. I think it's a relevant time to shoot this to you, Paul. Our audience is asking that, can you elaborate a little bit on effective managers? What makes a manager effective?
Yeah. Well, I love the question. You know, it's so much of my...
We can talk till morning on that.
Yes, we sure can. So I'm going to tell you that in that research, effectiveness was measured more as a function of the capacity to connect to the people that you're leading, right? So, so that was what comes out of that research. I think, you know, my view of effective, you know, leadership is that it begins by being self-aware. So I spend a lot of time, a lot of my research time and teaching time is around values. I think leaders who are connected to their values are grounded and they can regulate themselves. I think that it involves effective interactions with others, and a lot of that is giving space, effectively guidance and space to the others so that their best ideas can surface. You know, we teach a concept called psychological safety, which means you run a team in a way that people feel willing to give their best ideas. I think that's one of the best things leaders can do. By the way, listening, I think, is the #1 contribution to that. And,
right.
and to keep people focused on the strategy.
Right. Actually, at the times that we are talking so much about building and sustaining trust, I think psychological safety is a totally important element to achieve this goal, if I may say. I think we will go back to this leadership issue at the end of our conversation, maybe in more detail, but let's carry on with the social class element. Why do you think this is underrated? Why do you think companies, organizations are not paying so much attention to this social class, whereas they are spending a hell lot of money for gender initiatives or for race-based initiatives?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you said, you talked about the research that talked about a lot of these efforts coming out of a intention to avoid lawsuits. So in the United States, it's illegal to, there's a set of groups that are kind of protected and rightfully get equal treatment in terms of labor law, but social class is not one of those groups. And I think in a sense, almost nowhere is it a kind of protected group in the law. In some places, like in the United Kingdom, it's under discussion right now. But that's one issue. But then I think you can go deeper and say, well, why is it? Why is it that we recognize these other groups but not social class? I think that it is in some sense a kind of taboo topic. People may be reticent, more reticent, you know, social class. It turns out that it's not invisible. People can sense it by the way somebody speaks and mannerisms and so on. But it certainly isn't as visible as gender and race. So there's perhaps this idea that there's a kind of individual strategy to kind of conceal social class origins. It just doesn't get raised into the conversation. You know, on the flip side of that, in the United States, it is, it's actually amazingly legitimate that people can express kind of social class bigotry in a way that you couldn't for other groups, you know. And my some 30 years working at universities, I've never heard anybody say, well, this candidate for a job is less appealing because of race or gender. They may have thought it, but no one's ever said it, but I have heard people say the same thing for social class origins. So, you know, it's perhaps the kind of last legitimate form of bigotry in the United States. And I think it's fascinating, the question why, but when we're thinking about organizations, it's just been a kind of slower topic to get to the attention. I will say now that I am kind of optimistic that in the next decade, there'll be a sea change on this. The article I wrote, I've heard, you know, very warm receptions. I've had people from the top of some of the biggest organizations reach out and say, well, what can we be doing to be doing better here? So I have got the conclusion there that there's a kind of intent to address this problem now as well.
It's good to hear that, and I think also it was one of the most read articles that we have published in this issue. So it received the same warm welcome here in Turkey as well, if I may say, Paul. Well, the other thing is the social class, especially the let's say the lower class people have many disadvantages, but what are the main reasons for these disadvantages? Is it they are less educated, or is it they are less exposed to networks of connection? Yeah. What are the main factors of problems here?
Yeah, great question. Well, statistically in the United States, education is important, right? So if you do a analysis for the kind of mediation between the social class disadvantage and social class origins, the fact that people from lower social classes get less education, it's important. It's perhaps half of the effect. But then I also have to, you know, you got to think about why that is. So there's a phenomenon I think that you'll be aware of, that there's been a real tendency in the last decade or so for us to demand university degrees for jobs that previously didn't require university degrees. So we call this degree inflation, right? So one of the most compelling statistics is in the United States now, some 67% of job advertisements for production supervisors, for supervisors in a factory, require a college degree. 15% of the people who hold those jobs have a college degree, you know, so you don't need the degree for the job, but it's being required. The evidence, by the way, is that people from lower social class origins are not less intelligent from other people. You know, we've got the same kind of evidence that we look at, for example, to show you know, that why that conclusion is mistaken based on race and gender. You get the same kinds of effects, that if people have kind of the right context, they show up as intelligent on tests and so on, regardless of social class. I think that ultimately, and I think this point is under-recognized, I think that ultimately the key determination is cultural and social capital. So I agree with you about networks. And I would say even more to the root of it, that people from lower social class origins just don't learn enough about institutions, about how schools and companies work. You know, so in the United States, you can, you know, your family income does not keep you out of Harvard University. You know, Harvard University has a policy that anyone who can qualify for entrance, they'll have the money to go. But there are these barriers in knowing how to access, you know, these institutions, and knowing how to do the test, and knowing how to talk to your professor and things like that. You know, there's been a really interesting recent study. It's actually done by a professor at the School of Education at Harvard, Anthony Abraham Jack, who looked at college students, and actually they were often minority college students, but he looked at differences in their social class origins, and he found that it wasn't money that stopped them from thriving at college. It was just not knowing, in a sense, how things work, not knowing how to take advantage of the office hours of the faculty, not knowing how to contest a grade or find a way through a program. And they found that if somebody who was born poor had mentoring on those issues, they succeeded. They did as well in college as somebody who had, more money behind them. But the people who were doubly disadvantaged was the word that the professor used. They were the ones who were poor, yes, but also they lacked the mentoring and the awareness of how the system worked. So ultimately,
Right.
I think that cultural capital, this kind of awareness of how schools and organizations work, is a kind of key differentiator. And I think point to try and resolve this disadvantage.
Yeah, I think those are really very important points. We have been seeing the same pain points even in Turkey. For instance, when you look at the job descriptions of the job ads, you see that lots of the employers are looking for people from certain universities, but it's obvious that it is not a requirement to be graduated from this university or that university to do this job. And when I chat with the people who are freshly out of universities, they really complain about this. But at the end of the day, it is about to change, I think, with the new perspective on looking to capability set more than the diploma is going to change this dynamic. This is what I believe, or it will be my wishful thinking, if I may say. But is it a way that lower class people can make their way throughout this system, Paul? Are they doomed to stay behind, or is there a way, or there are some good examples that show us that they can also thrive?
Yeah, I think it's really important. And I want to really come out strongly to say that they're not doomed. This is kind of one of the tensions about doing this kind of research that shows a disadvantage like that. I would never recommend to anybody that they view themselves as predestined to get a suboptimal outcome. The truth of the matter is, you referred to it, that yes, there's a statistical tendency, but you do get lots of people from lower social class origins that go on to impactful managerial roles. It happens all the time. Not as often as people but from other groups, but it is completely possible. So, at an individual level, I think having agency, the idea that you do affect your own outcomes, I think that is the most likely strategy. So that's what I would always coach anybody towards. But of course, be aware about your own position in the system. And I think what that means is someone from lower social class origins would be particularly likely to benefit from having a mentor. I think most likely somebody who had come from a world like theirs and had transcended it, who could tell them, in a sense, be their kind of coach about how to progress through the system. So I do think it's a function of your own agency. I do think it's a function of your own efforts and strategies. But I think that the thing that people from lower social class origins are missing is understanding that if you apply to Harvard University and get in, somebody will make sure you have the money. Understanding that when you get to Harvard University, that the faculty are there to help you after hours if you don't understand what happens in class. So I think seeking out that mentoring to close this gap in cultural capital is probably the single best strategy.
Right. Yeah, that's a very important point, Paul. I appreciate that you highlighted it. And finally, when you look at the organizational level or the companies, have you ever come up with a good system or a program that is overcoming this issue? Have you seen any good examples?
Yeah, I've seen a few good examples, and I'd like to talk about one that I didn't mention much in my article, but as I've learned more about it, I think it's a great example, and that is Uber. So, Uber is a tech company, and as it was explained to me by their head of diversity, social class is a huge issue in tech. The way it was put to me is that you really have to have access to a computer from the time you can crawl to get to an impactful position in a Google or a Amazon, or, or an Uber. So it's a really big barrier. But Uber has been one of the most intentional organizations in overcoming it. They're the only organization I've come across in the United States that has an employee resource group that's based on social class, right? So, many organizations will have groups for various gender and ethnic and LGBTQ groups and so on to kind of build community and support and share resources. Only Uber has one based on social class. It came out of their experience in Latin America, where social class was a really kind of salient boundary. They've had some real benefits from it. So they have innovations in their interface with drivers that they learned about from insights that came by including people with this experience in their decision making. So one thing concrete there is, I think it was in the last year, they introduced the fact that when you finish your shift as a driver, you get paid within something like an hour of finishing your shift, right? So, of course, in so many jobs, being paid 2 weeks after your work is fine. It's the way it works, and people have kind of 2 weeks of kind of ready cash. But a lot of the people who were driving for Uber, that wasn't true. And when Uber could say, look, you'll do the work, and then you'll have access to the money, it was really life-changing for a number of people there. They have another program where they've committed to promoting people into the training for managerial jobs coming from their customer service part of the organization. So customer service, by the way, you talked about intersectionality. Customer service at Uber is mostly racial minorities. It's mostly women, but also it's people from lower social class origins. And what Uber has said is, look, we're going to find the people here who are aspirational and ambitious and want training and so on, and we're going to put this group, right? So being willing to find leadership capability anywhere in the organization, I think that's the best practice here. And also something else that Uber did, which I thought was quite enlightened, is, I mentioned earlier that there's a taboo, right? So, in a sense, there's probably more CEOs from lower social class origins that we might guess, but they don't advertise the fact. So what Uber did is they had their leadership list their very worst jobs on LinkedIn. So if you'd ever worked at McDonald's, that would go on LinkedIn. If you'd ever worked in a gas station, that would go on LinkedIn. So in a sense, they're trying to take away the taboo that might be associated with these kinds of jobs. So I thought that they're exemplary in a number of ways.
Right. It's really interesting to hear that. I think they had learned their lesson after all the incidents going through. And we had the opportunity to host Francis Fry here, who also did a great job of turning around Uber's HR and organizational strategy. So it's really interesting to hear from you as well. So Paul, we are approaching the end of the session. We have a couple of questions, but before moving to questions, I had a final big question for you. We have been going through really interesting times of uncertainty, and it's putting a huge pressure on leadership issues. So what is your take about the perspective of leadership? Do you see an evolution or a change in the perspective for leadership with this pandemic?
Yeah, I think I do. I'm going to link it back to something I said earlier, that I think what we've a big effect in the United States, and I think around the world, of the pandemic is that just trust in institutions has been shaken. How do you lead in a world where there's no kind of assumption that because you're the governor of the state or the CEO of a pharmaceutical company that you are kind of with integrity and that you're trustworthy? So I think that humility is going to be even more important for leaders in the next decade than it was in the last decade, as important as it was. this is not a kind of new ingredient to effective leadership in my view, but in past years, I might talk about humility as a key driver, differentiator for leadership, and it would spark an argument. I get less of an argument about it now. So I think the capacity to listen to others, to be able to put your own position kind of in context. That doesn't mean don't take decisions. We need people who take decisions, but to understand that your own kind of cognition is not necessarily should be privileged in all circumstances over other people who have more insight, and to understand your responsibilities to the collective. So I do think that, and in fact, it's a source of some optimism for me, that I think that we could see a new leadership model coming out of this. And I think it will involve humility, service, and kind of connected to the people that you're leading, connection to the people you're leading.
Thank you very much, Paul. Last but not least, we have two questions from the audience. Ömer Açıkgöz from the audience is asking that, how do we support organizational citizenship behavior in companies? What do you think we should do for this?
Yes. So I think I've got kind of two thoughts on that. One is a kind of organizational design issue. I mentioned that I do some work on values earlier, and I've become very interested in the idea that we can build really effective organizations where people want to be good organizational citizens if there's connections based on values, right? So I've done some work, I've done some empirical work that shows that if people share values, they give more to the organization, they're more collaborative, and so on. And I'm starting to try and take that into the world of how you use machine learning and other techniques to find people who are going to work together. So I guess the first thing I would say is build teams and organizations where people can see that the organization is oriented towards the things that matter most to them. And when I say values, I don't mean simply an attitude to something, some kind of social good. I think those things are often together. But, values are kind of deeper things like integrity, collaboration, innovation. These are the kinds of things that show up as values. And if people share those with the people they're working with, they give much more to the collective effort. And then the other thing I would say that perhaps managers can do with the people they have is I think the decentralization brings up a lot of opportunities for citizenship. I was having a lovely conversation with Serdar before we began about how things may be new in terms of learning for the new generation. Well, the new generation also has different ideas about how organizations can fulfill their roles within societies and economies. And I've heard some great success stories from CEOs who've been willing to give a little bit of space and resources to people lower in the organization to try and pursue some of these issues that to them are citizenship. This doesn't mean advocating. I think these are always a kind of negotiation between different parts of the organization about what citizenship means, but at least opening up space to make sure that that's an inclusive conversation as well.
Another question from the audience by Faisal Hakim, and Faisal is asking that, how do you feel about responsible or sustainable capitalism as a concept? Do you think more companies will focus on stakeholder outcomes rather than the financial ones?
Yes. So I do think that that probably that we're just. I don't think that reaching that position is going to require kind of wrenching shifts and say like the rules of kind of listing on a stock exchange and so on. I do think that we certainly are getting indications, and some of my colleagues have been doing some very interesting research here, that consumers will reward certain organizations that they view as aligned with their broader stakeholder interests. Sometimes employees are looking for organizations that are aligned there. So I do think that within the scope of just kind of organizational success, it makes sense to think about the interests of customers and employees in the broadest sense. I mean, that's very motivating for them. So, you know, I suppose I would say that I view that as something in the future, but I guess my position is not that we should be legislating that. I think instead that if we can make the kind of information sharing and kind of an understanding of externalities and organizations' broad impact apparent, that I think customers and employees will self-select. So I think that that's the way that I would hope that we're going to get to that future.
Paul, thank you very much. We have already exceeded our time, but it's really a pleasure to talk to you. And I really appreciate your time and effort for being here today and sharing your ideas with us. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
It's such a pleasure, Sudar. Thanks to everybody for joining. I'll be happy to hear from anybody on email or other sources. Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Değerli izleyicilerimiz, çok teşekkür ediyoruz bu akşam bizlerle birlikte olduğunuz için. Sahiden Paul çok değişik bir açıyla baktı bu konuya. Umarım ki bahsettiği çözümler önümüzdeki dönemde hızlıca hayata geçer. Önümüzdeki haftalarda farklı konuklarımızla farklı konuları Fikir ve Önderleri yayınımızda ele almaya devam edeceğiz. Bu akşam bizlerle birlikte olduğunuz için, bizi izlediğiniz için teşekkür ediyoruz. Hepinize sağlıklı ve mutlu günler diliyoruz efendim. Hoşça kalın.